I want to tell you a story about something that happened to my grandma. When she was a young woman, her favorite thing to do was to go out with her girlfriends and dance. She was from a coastal town in the south of France, and there was an American military base nearby. She would go dancing with whomever asked, but she was never interested in going home with any of them. She was walking home one night when a group of men in a car drove alongside her. They were speaking English and asked to give her a ride. She refused several times, but then eventually, a few of the men jumped out of the car and grabbed her. She was scared and told the men she needed to go home. They started punching her and drove her up to the top of the mountain that overlooked most of the city. That's when the men took her out of the car and threw her on the ground. They all took turns assaulting and hitting her. She said she just stopped fighting after the first few, and she hoped they'd just hurry up and leave her alone. Then one of the men told another something she didn't understand and gestured over to a big rock. Another said something gesturing to the cliff. She looked at the man straight into his eyes as he picked up the big rock, then he threw it right next to her head. She doesn't know if he did that intentionally or if he just missed, but she played dead, and after a few more kicks, the men eventually drove away. She laid there for a minute, far away from home, alone, cold, and badly beaten. She just looked up at the stars for a while, in shock of what had just happened to her. Then something snapped her out of her dissociating trance. She wasn't 100% sure if it was just her imagination, but she was hearing a car. They were coming back. She knew this area, and knew there was a cliff that seemingly looked like it went straight down, but there was a little ledge there. She struggled and crawled as fast as she could to roll herself off the cliff and onto the small ledge, pushing herself as close to the mountain wall as she could. She had just barely tucked herself into the ledge, and sure enough, she heard tires slowly creep up near her. They came back to finish the job. She could see the headlights from the car and squeezed her eyes shut, afraid to move or breathe. They all got out and searched for her. Their voices sounded panicked and frantic, eventually even coming right to the cliff. They stood there for what she said felt like the longest minutes of her life. Eventually she thought she heard them walk away, but hadn't heard the car. She almost got up a few times. Luckily she didn't, because they stayed there for a while. When she did hear them finally leave, she felt safe enough to get up. She then had to walk home, across town in the dark. She was terrified that they'd find her. She walked miles, with her eyes swelling shut with broken ribs and in constant fear. She was hiding every time she heard a vehicle, and then she finally got home, just as her 11 siblings were getting up for school. She just crawled into bed in her dark room. Finally, her mom popped her head into the room, noticing she'd just come home. She only said one word to my grandma: "Whore." My grandma never reported it because it was a different time back then. This was just after World War II, and she's certain it was American soldiers who tried to kill her. She wasn't interested in the entire town knowing the trauma she'd been through. She just told family that she fell dancing, or got into a fight, or hurt herself some other way. There's no justice to this story. Unfortunately, all too often, evil men get away with the horrific things they've done. I just hope wherever those men are, they are haunted by what they did to a young girl who did nothing to deserve or provoke them. My grandma recently passed away, and she was my best friend. She was the strongest woman I've ever met. She was funny and always tried to teach me how to be independent and take care of myself. She told me after this ordeal that the only men she could ever trust were gay men, so she surrounded herself with them and had lifelong friendships with all my uncles. She still went out dancing and singing and didn't let this change the things she loved doing. I love her for that too. I should begin by giving a summary of how I came to know about the events in this story. A girlfriend of mine, whom I was dating for several years back in the early 2000s, told me about this bizarre occurrence. To better understand the reason that I wholeheartedly believe the details of the story, and to emphasize the fact that there is virtually no possibility of a logical explanation, I need to explain a bit about my ex-girlfriend. She was 20 years old, and I was 22 at that time. I'm now 47 in 2024. My girlfriend's name was Jenna. She was extremely sweet and a little naive, endearingly so. Some facts about Jenna and her character are that Jenna has never experienced or been diagnosed with any mental illness, either before or after the events of this story took place. On the rare occasions that she attempted to lie or to exaggerate a story, it was always obvious because she was a very bad liar. I knew Jenna well enough at that time that I was able to determine if she was even slightly embellishing something for dramatic effect. She really did not have a duplicitous bone in her body. I have shared this story with later girlfriends, acquaintances, my friends and family, and also while donating a small portion of my precious time during a short stint in prison. I would recount this to a small group of my fellow inmates gathered around my bunk in the evening. All got the chills, and many were completely freaked out, knowing that I was not bullshitting them. As I can best recall the incident just as it was told to me, it was the early 2000s, and I was living in Central California in the San Joaquin Valley, which is near Bakersfield. Specifically, I grew up in a town between Fresno and Bakersfield. As I mentioned earlier, I was dating a girl named Jenna, and by the time she had relayed the story to me, we had been together for quite a while. I was well acquainted with her idiosyncrasies and her inability to lie or stretch the truth convincingly. On the day this took place, Jenna was driving to her aunt and female cousin's apartment in town. I think specifically to visit this female cousin, who was approximately the same age as Jenna. The two were very close, having grown up together. In this apartment, her aunt and her female cousin, whose name was Stacy, lived there alone. Stacy's father had been out of the picture, apparently for quite a long time, a common scenario in my experience. Jenna's closeness with her family afforded her pretty much unrestricted access to all her immediate family's homes and apartments. Having spare keys for most of them, she was welcome to come and go as she pleased. This also included unannounced visits. I honestly cannot remember specifically if we had cell phones back then for normal use. We could be what you would refer to as poor white trash, defined as financially disadvantaged only, not from a shallow gene pool. Anyhow, the point being that Jenna, going over to her aunt and cousin Stacy's apartment that day, did not require a phone call to them announcing her visit. She went with no advance notice and drove up to their apartment that afternoon. As it was described to me, the apartment complex was 2 floors with a dirt patch in the front, near the street that could be parked on, but the tenants' parking was in the rear of the building, with all the front doors facing the street. These apartments had one entrance, and no access out the back. I was told by Jenna, and knew myself from driving by the area many times in the past. There was one large window in the front of each apartment, though none in the back, nor the sides of the apartment. This complex was not the best of places, but her aunt and Jenna's female cousin, Stacy, both had bedrooms of their own. Jenna had driven over and parked in front of the place. The tenant parking was in the back, so she had no reason to believe that either one or both of her family members weren't at home, though she would not be able to see their vehicles from the front street side, where she had parked. Jenna did as she normally did, and headed up one flight of stairs. She walked 3 apartments down the open breezeway to her aunt and cousin's door. She tried the doorknob, and finding it locked, used her key to open the door without knocking. This was not unusual for her. Even though the apartment complex was not in the most glamorous part of town, hence the locked door, Jenna still knew she was more than welcome to enter semi-unannounced. After unlocking the front door, she stepped inside. Not immediately seeing either her aunt or her cousin Stacy upon entering, she walked from the front door to her left and looked inside the small kitchen area, also finding no one there. She called out to her aunt and Stacy, "Hey guys, it's just me." Getting no reply, Jenna then began walking down the short hallway that led to the 2 bedrooms in the back of the small apartment. The first room to her right was her aunt's room. She glanced inside, but seeing no one, she began again calling out, "Hey Stacy, it's Jen." After this too elicited no response, Jenna headed further down the hallway. At this time, Jenna recalls that she was fairly convinced that no one was at home, since it would be nearly impossible not to have heard her when she announced herself more than once inside the small space. From her vantage point in the hallway, the one bathroom at the end was vacant, and the lights in the apartment were, for the most part, turned off, with the exception of her cousin's. Oddly, the room's singular light illuminated the hallway faintly. I assume for the sake of thoroughness, Jenna then walked a few steps to her cousin's doorway and turned to look inside. To her left were her cousin's dresser drawers, and directly in front of her was her cousin Stacy's bed. There Jenna saw that Stacy was sitting upright, but motionless, on the edge of her small mattress, facing away from Jenna and the room's doorway. Jenna was momentarily surprised, as most people would be. She assumed had there not been something wrong, her cousin would have surely replied to her when she first entered the apartment. "Hey Stacy, what's up girl? Are you okay?" Her cousin, still sitting on the mattress's edge, made no movement in response that would indicate she was aware that Jenna had said anything to her, or even that she was aware of Jenna's presence at the doorway to her room. Now becoming increasingly concerned about her cousin, Jenna began moving further into the room toward the bed. She was confused by Stacy's strange behavior and imagined all the worst-case scenarios that could explain Stacy's rigid, unmoving posture. At that moment, as she neared the end of Stacy's bed, her aunt's voice came from the living room area. Then she heard the familiar sounds of the front door opening and what was most likely someone with arms full of grocery bags coming in. She could hear the cheerful banter typical of her aunt and the unmistakable voice of Stacy, her cousin, whose bed she was now facing away from. As she listened to the commotion in the kitchen, Jenna was now in a semi-state of shock and confusion, with her face pinched and eyebrows furrowed. She was lifting her head with a labor as she tried to rationalize and make sense of all the contradicting sensory input, all in less than a second of actual time. It was seemingly like a movie scene set to slow motion. Finding her voice, Jenna softly called down the hallway. Hey Auntie, it's Jen. I just stopped, Then she paused herself mid-sentence. Jenna's voice trailed off, replaced by the thumping of her own heart. A cold dread washed over her as she slowly turned back toward Stacy's room. To her horror, the figure on the bed had turned its head, but in an unnatural way, without moving its shoulders or lower body at all. What should have been there, the familiar face of her cousin, was gone. Instead, it was replaced by a grotesque visage that stared back at her, its skin gray like campfire ash, sharp angles where there should have been curves, with an emotionless gaze and a mouth with no discernible lips or expression that would betray its intentions. Its black eyes were deep-set in dark pits and devoid of life. Not angry, but slightly squinting, reflecting the image of herself in them as she stood there in front of it, a vulgar creature defying her reality. She screamed, the sound ripping through the little apartment as she bolted down the hallway, bursting into the kitchen where her aunt and Stacy were unpacking groceries. "Auntie, Stacy, there's something in Stacy's room," her words tumbling out in a frantic jumble. Her aunt and cousin looked at each other and then back at Jenna. "What are you talking about, Jenna?" Stacy asked, likely confused that her cousin had just emerged from the back of their apartment. "We just got home a minute ago." Jenna grabbed her cousin's arm frantically. "No, there's another Stacy. She's not right. She's in your room." The three cautiously returned to Stacy's room. Jenna, her body shaking visibly, hesitated to look inside, but the room was now empty. A chill ran down Jenna's spine. The demon-like entity that defied logical description, so horrifying that her mind felt unhinged, was now gone, but she knew what she had seen. It wasn't a hallucination, not a trick of the light. It was something else entirely, something evil that had worn her cousin's face like a mask. The only sign of recent occupancy of the bed was the faint indentation on the mattress where the thing had been sitting. Jenna's aunt and cousin searched the apartment, their voices hushed in the sudden silence, but there was no trace of her cousin's doppelganger. No back windows to escape through, no hidden doors or exits, no access panels, service hatches, or attic space, and no possible explanation for its sudden disappearance. She never went to her aunt and cousin's apartment after this, and I can't recall her telling me if they even stayed much longer there. I believe the events of that day left a scar on Jenna's soul, a terrifying reminder that the world held mysteries far darker than she had ever imagined. She could never quite shake the feeling that she had glimpsed something truly evil, a creature that could mimic human form, but possessed a dark energy as cold and empty as the void. To this day, I can still see the fear in Jenna's eyes as she recounted her traumatic experience with the doppelganger. It was a fear that resonated deep within her, a fear that whispered of the unknown and the unknowable. And though years have passed, and Jenna and I have gone our separate ways, the memory of her story still lingers in my mind. It disturbs me, and most of the people that I have retold it to. An unnerving and freakish reminder that the most terrifying monsters are the ones we can't explain away, especially to ourselves. My name is Hasina, and I'm 20 years old now. The story goes back to 2018, which was 5.5 years ago. I was 14 at the time, and I was using Instagram a lot. I had about 10 to 15,000 followers, and I started talking to a guy who told me he was 15. But no, the hell he wasn't. He was 17, soon to be 18. A few months later, he asked me to be his girlfriend, and I was stupid enough to say yes. To this day, I regret saying yes. After the first month, he was very nice to me, but then he started showing his evil face. He would fight over nothing and call me names, then block me. I would make a new account and beg him to come back. This went on for 9 months until he told me that he never loved me. He did try to love me, but he couldn't. I was done, and I told him I was leaving, but this time he begged me not to. I stayed with him after everything. Time went on, and he started asking for nudes. I was so in love with him that I agreed just to make him happy. After a few more months, we broke up, and that was it for a while. Our paths crossed again 3 years later, when I was 18 and he was 21. We started talking again, at first just as friends, and he was very nice, better than ever, and I got played again, thinking he had changed. We got back together soon after. Day after day, he got worse, and I regretted giving him a second chance. He would force me to send him pictures of my body. After that, I tried to break up with him so many times, but he was always blackmailing me because he knew he could ruin my life with those pictures. My family would be so disappointed in me for sending them, since in our religion and culture, it's forbidden. He knew that and used it against me. For that stupid guy, I went against everything, even though we lived in 2 different states. But he knew where I lived, and he could easily come to my house. After a few months, we got engaged. I knew he wouldn't leave me alone, but he said he would never hurt me and promised me a lot of things, so I agreed to get engaged with him. Well, you probably guessed it, he went back to his old behavior. He made me drop out of college and leave my job. He didn't want me to go out because he didn't trust me, even though I never gave him any reasons not to. One day, I got tired of it all and I broke things off. He lost it and started threatening me, so I had to call the cops. Less than 20 hours later, he drove the 14 hours to my state and showed up to my house with a gun to kill me. I called the cops and he got caught, then went to jail. But he got out with a $100,000 bond, and I got a restraining order against him. I wish that was the end of it, but it isn't. One day after work, I was walking to my house because my job was only a 10-minute walk. I saw his car following and I had to call the cops. He didn't even deny that it was him. 2 weeks after that, me and my friends went to a parking lot where we could see the whole place with lights because it's on the upper hill. He was there too, and as soon as he noticed me, he started chasing after me. Then a few minutes after that, I lost him. After that, I changed my phone number and my social media. I made one mistake when I was a kid, and I almost paid for it with my life. I just hope I get rid of him because I'm very tired of dealing with it all. I used to love him, but now I hate him very much.